When we bought the house, it felt like a steal. A beautiful Victorian-era home with wraparound porches, towering gables, and stained glass windows. Practically a dream. The kind of place you could imagine raising a family in. My wife, Caroline, and I moved in during late September, just in time for the leaves to turn and autumn to settle around us. It was perfect, or so we thought. The house was old. Drafts whispered through the hallways, and the wooden floors groaned as if they were alive. These quirks seemed normal at first, the kind of thing you'd expect in a home over 100 years old. But soon we realized there was something off. It began with small things. Misplaced objects, doors we swore we'd closed swinging open. We joked about the house being haunted, a playful way to brush off the unease. But then the nights grew longer and the jokes stopped. One night, I woke to a faint creaking sound. It was slow and deliberate, like footsteps moving through the upstairs hallway. I glanced at the clock. 3:14 a.m. Caroline was fast asleep beside me, her breathing steady. I listened, frozen in place, as the creaks moved closer to our bedroom door. Then silence. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The next morning, Caroline laughed it off. "Old houses make noise," she said, though. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. So I did what any rational person would do. I set up my old digital recorder in the hallway outside our bedroom. I let it run overnight, hoping to catch some proof of these noises. What I captured chilled me to my core. At first, it was just static and the occasional creak of the house settling. But around 3 a.m., the recording picked up something else. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. Then a voice, faint, almost inaudible, but distinctly there. It whispered something I couldn't quite make out, followed by a low, guttural hum that rose and fell like someone humming a tune out of key. When I played the recording for Caroline, her face turned pale. That can't be real," she stammered. But it was. After that, the activity became impossible to ignore. The noises grew louder, more persistent. The doors didn't just swing open, they slammed. Shadows moved in the corners of our vision, disappearing when we turned to look. One night, while watching TV in the living room, the chandelier above us began to sway. At first, I thought it was an earthquake, but the floor remained steady. Then, the swaying stopped, and the chandelier began to twist, as if an unseen hand were spinning it deliberately. Caroline screamed, and we bolted out of the room. Desperate for answers, I set up cameras in several rooms. Over the course of a week, I reviewed hours of footage. Most of it was uneventful, but 2 clips stood out. The first was from the kitchen. Around 2:45 a.m., the overhead light flickered, and one of the chairs slid away from the table as if yanked by an invisible force. Stopped abruptly, then tipped over. The second clip, from the upstairs hallway, showed a shadow moving across the wall. It wasn't the shadow of a person. It was too tall, too distorted. It seemed to stretch unnaturally, lingering for a moment before melting into the darkness. By now, it was clear we were dealing with something beyond our understanding. Caroline wanted to leave, but I felt compelled to stay. I needed to know what was happening, what we were dealing with. I reached out to a local paranormal investigator, a man named Alan who'd been studying hauntings for over 2 decades. Alan arrived with a team and enough equipment to outfit a sci-fi movie. EMF detectors, infrared cameras, thermal scanners, and spirit boxes. They spent 2 nights in the house, recording and observing. What they found was unsettling. "The activity here is intense," Alan said, his voice grim. "We've captured multiple EVPs, electronic voice phenomena, and there's a strong electromagnetic presence in the house." He played back some of the recordings. One stood out. A voice, clear and sharp, whispered, "Get out, The night after the investigation was the worst. We were lying in bed when the temperature in the room plummeted. The air felt heavy, pressing down on us. Then came the sound, a low, droning hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. It grew louder, deafening, until the bedroom door burst open with a violent bang. A figure stood in the doorway. I couldn't see its face, but its outline was unmistakable, tall, gaunt, with arms that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. It didn't move, just stood there, watching us. Caroline clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. The door slammed shut, and the room was silent again. That was the final straw. We couldn't live like this anymore. The house had turned from a dream into a nightmare. The next morning, I called Alan and practically begged him and his team to do whatever it took to cleanse the house. He warned us that it wasn't always possible to get rid of something like this, but they'd do their best. For their services, they charged more than we could comfortably afford, but at that point, we didn't care. We just wanted to feel safe again. Alan's team arrived that evening. They came equipped with more than just cameras and sensors this time. They had candles, herbs, small vials of some liquid, and a box filled with items they refused to explain. Caroline and I were instructed to leave the house while they worked. They said it would be safer for everyone. We didn't argue. Alan motioned toward their van. It was set up like a mobile command center, with screens hooked up to their cameras inside the house. From there, we could watch everything unfold in real time. The thought of seeing that figure again terrified me, but I also felt an odd compulsion to witness whatever happened next. Inside the van, Caroline and I sat on a narrow bench, staring at the monitors as Alan's team spread out through the house. There were 4 of them, each wearing headlamps that cut through the dim, shadowy interiors of the rooms. On one screen, I could see the living room, where 2 of the investigators were arranging candles in a circle on the coffee table. On another screen, a 3rd team member was sprinkling some kind of powder along the baseboards in the upstairs hallway. The final camera feed showed Alan himself in our bedroom, holding a strange, silver pendulum that swayed gently in his hand. The audio feeds crackled with static, punctuated by the occasional murmur of the team's voices. They spoke in low, deliberate tones, as if trying not to disturb something. Alan began chanting. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was rhythmic and commanding, like he was trying to assert dominance over whatever was in the house. As he spoke, the temperature in the van seemed to drop. I glanced at Caroline and she nodded. She felt it too. Then something happened on the screen. In the upstairs hallway, the powder the investigator had sprinkled began to move. At first, it seemed to shift subtly, as if disturbed by a breeze. But then it started to swirl violently, forming strange, looping patterns on the floor. "We've got activity in the hallway," one of the team members said through the van speakers. His voice was steady, but I could tell he was nervous. In the living room, the candles flickered wildly, their flames stretching and bending as if blown by a wind none of us could feel. The 2 investigators there exchanged a glance and began chanting as well, their voices joining Alan's in a rising, discordant chorus. And then, on the bedroom feed, we saw it. The figure. It was there again, standing in the corner of the room. The headlamp on Alan's forehead illuminated its outline, revealing just how wrong it was. Its body seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, its limbs too long, its head cocked at an impossible angle. Alan didn't falter. He kept chanting, his voice growing louder and more forceful. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, as if waiting. Suddenly, every monitor in the van went black. Caroline gasped, and I felt my stomach drop. For a few agonizing seconds, there was nothing but silence and static. Then, one by one, the feeds flickered back on. The house was in chaos. In the living room, One of the candles had fallen over, its flame extinguished. The investigators scrambled to relight it, their movements hurried and frantic. Upstairs, the hallway camera showed doors slamming open and shut, as if caught in a violent storm. And in the bedroom, Alan was no longer alone. The figure had moved closer. It loomed over him now, its shadow engulfing nearly the entire frame. Alan's chant grew almost frantic, his voice trembling but resolute. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial, throwing its contents at the figure. The shadow recoiled violently, and for a brief moment, it seemed to waver, like smoke caught in a breeze. Then it was gone. But the team didn't celebrate. Alan lowered the vial he'd just hurled. His shoulders tense and his breathing labored. "This isn't over," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He turned to the others through his headset. "Everyone, hold your positions. It's still here. It's just shifted." I heard this through the van speakers and felt a cold pit in my stomach. Caroline squeezed my hand. "What does he mean? Shifted?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. On the monitors, the team moved swiftly. They began setting up additional tools, pulling out strange devices I hadn't seen before. One looked like a glass jar with glowing runes etched onto its surface. Another was a bundle of twisted wires and small mirrors, which Alan called conduits, as he placed them in the center of our bedroom. Over the next few hours, the team methodically worked through the house, room by room. They performed rituals in each space, chanting in unison while burning herbs that filled the air with a thick, acrid smoke. Through the monitors, we watched them move as if they were in a dangerous dance, constantly looking over their shoulders, their voices steady but edged with tension. In the living room, the investigators placed what Alan called anchor points along the walls and windows. These were small, metallic objects, each inscribed with symbols that glowed faintly when activated. "The entity is tied to this space," Alan explained through the speakers. "We need to contain it before we can force it to leave." As they worked, strange things continued to happen. Lights flickered erratically, plunging rooms into sudden darkness before snapping back on. Objects moved of their own accord, chairs scraping across the floor, picture frames tilting off-center. At one point, the camera in the kitchen caught a knife sliding off the counter and spinning lazily in midair before clattering to the ground. Caroline buried her face in her hands. "How can they stand being in there?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer for that either. Around midnight, the entity struck back. The team had just finished their ritual in the upstairs hallway when every camera feed in the van erupted into chaos. The screens flashed with static, and the audio was a cacophony of banging, humming, and what sounded like a low, guttural growl. When the feed stabilized, I saw Alan and the others huddled together in the living room. They were breathing hard, their faces pale with fear. "It's resisting," Alan said through clenched teeth. "It's stronger than I thought." He pulled out a small black book and began flipping through the pages. "We'll have to force it out with a direct expulsion. Everyone, prepare the sigil." The team sprang into action. They began arranging objects into a precise pattern on the living room floor. Candles, jars, the strange conduits, and a large, circular mat covered in intricate symbols. One investigator drew a series of markings on the walls using a chalky substance that glowed faintly under their headlamps. By 3 a.m., the house seemed to come alive. The air inside quivered with a palpable tension, and even from the van, I could feel the vibrations reverberating through the ground. The cameras captured shadows darting across walls where no one stood, and the audio picked up faint whispers that grew louder and more insistent. Alan stood in the center of the sigil, holding the silver pendulum. His voice rose above the din, commanding and forceful as he chanted words. The other team members joined him, their voices forming a steady rhythm that seemed to push back against the chaos. And then it appeared. The figure materialized in the middle of the living room, its form flickering like a distorted image on an old TV. It was no longer just a shadow. This time, it was fully formed, its long limbs stretching unnaturally, its face still hidden in darkness. The air in the room seemed to vibrate around it, warping the camera feed. The entity moved toward Alan, its movements slow but deliberate. The candles around the sigil flared brightly, their flames stretching upward as if reaching for the ceiling. Alan didn't flinch. He raised the pendulum high and shouted a single word that echoed through the speakers with a strange, otherworldly resonance. The figure recoiled, letting out a sound that made the speakers crackle and hiss. It writhed violently, its form collapsing in on itself like smoke being sucked into a vacuum. The glowing symbols on the floor pulsed with light, brighter and brighter, until the cameras went white. The investigators were slumped against the walls, exhausted but unharmed. Alan sat cross-legged in the middle of the sigil, the pendulum resting in his lap. He looked directly at the camera and gave a weak but triumphant smile. "It's gone," he said simply. "We didn't return to the house until sunrise." When we stepped inside, the air felt different. Lighter, cleaner, as if a weight had been lifted. Alan's team was packing up their equipment, their movements slow and deliberate after the night's ordeal. "It's over," Alan assured us as he handed me the pendulum. "This should protect the house, keep it in a safe place." Caroline and I thanked them profusely, though words didn't feel like enough. As they drove away, I stood on the porch and looked out at the empty street, the morning sunlight casting long shadows across the lawn. For the first time in weeks, the house felt like ours again. Life gradually returned to normal after that night. The oppressive heaviness that had once filled every corner of the house was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt clean and calm. The floors no longer creaked as if under unseen footsteps, and the lights stayed steady, no longer flickering like nervous winks in the dark. Even the drafts, once icy and unsettling, now felt like nothing more than harmless whispers of the old house settling into itself. Caroline and I began to unpack the boxes we had hastily shoved into the guest room when the activity first began. We rehung the photos, dusted off the furniture, and started making the house a home again. Nights were quiet, and for the first time in weeks, we could fall asleep without holding our breath at every creak or groan of the old wood. It felt surreal to move through the space without fear, to sit in the living room without glancing over our shoulders or listening for whispers in the silence. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Caroline turned to me and said, "Can you believe it's over?" I shook my head, still not entirely able to wrap my mind around it. "We're lucky," she continued. "Lucky there are people like Alan and his team." She was right. It's easy to romanticize bravery, to talk about facing the unknown like it's some grand adventure. But I saw their faces that night, heard the tension in their voices. Alan and his team weren't fearless, they were terrified just like us. And yet, they stood their ground, stayed in that house when we couldn't, and confronted something most people would run from without looking back. They knew the risks, the toll it would take, and yet they showed up. They didn't just help us reclaim our home. They gave us back our peace of mind, something I didn't realize how much I valued until it was gone. Sometimes I still think about what it must have taken for Alan to stand there, face to face with whatever that thing was, and not waver. I replay the moment on the screen when he shouted that final command, his voice steady and unyielding, even as the entity twisted and fought against him. It wasn't just skill or training. It was something deeper, a determination, a belief that no one should have to live with that kind of fear in their own home. If people like Alan didn't exist, I don't know where we'd be now. So yes, life has returned to normal, but it's a normal we appreciate so much more now. Each quiet evening, each peaceful night of sleep feels like a gift. And every time I pass the little box where I keep the silver pendulum Alan gave us, I pause for a moment, thankful not just for him and his team, but for the courage it takes to fight the things most people can't even face. The house is ours again, but it wouldn't be without them.